It all began on a morning that looked like every other in the towering glass building of Clark and Hayes Enterprises. The city was alive with movement, the sound of cars, the rush of people chasing dreams, and the hum of ambition that filled the air. But that morning would change everything for Ronald Hayes, the young billionaire who had everything except peace. He was the kind of man people whispered about in admiration and envy. Sharp suit, perfect posture, eyes that could cut through silence. He was born into wealth but worked as if he'd built it himself. Yet behind that polished exterior, Ronald carried the weight of isolation that money could never lift. He spent his days surrounded by employees who smiled too much and cared too little, investors who praised him publicly but plotted privately, and friends who only existed when champagne was poured. His life was full yet completely empty, until the day she walked in. Samantha Green, 23, a business student from a modest background, beginning her internship in one of the most powerful companies in the country. She didn't walk with confidence born of arrogance, but with the quiet grace of someone who knew who she was. Her clothes were simple, her voice calm, and her eyes, warm, brown, honest, had something Ronald hadn't seen in years: sincerity. She didn't know who he was at first. She treated him like any other colleague, respectful but unafraid. And that was what drew him in. Their first conversation was accidental. She had dropped a stack of reports near the elevator, and he, surprisingly, bent down to help. "Thank you, sir," she said softly, looking up at him with a smile that felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. "Call me Ronald," he replied without thinking. It was strange. People usually stumbled over his last name, adding Mr. Hayes with nervous formality. But hearing his first name from her lips felt right. That small moment sparked something. Days passed, and Ronald found excuses to walk by her department, checking on progress, asking questions he already knew the answers to, anything to hear her voice for a few minutes. Samantha didn't seem impressed by his wealth or title. She was focused, passionate about learning, and treated everyone, from the janitor to the CEO, with the same kindness. She reminded him of the world he'd forgotten existed, one where people worked hard not for status, but for purpose. One evening, while most of the staff had left, Ronald saw her still working at her desk, surrounded by papers and coffee cups. "You're still here?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. She looked up, startled but smiling. "Yes, I just wanted to finish this report before tomorrow. I promised Mr. Keller I'd have it ready." "You know," he said, stepping closer, "most interns don't stay late unless they're trying to impress someone." Samantha chuckled softly. "I'm just trying to impress myself." That answer lingered in his mind long after he left. Weeks turned into months. The CEO and the intern grew closer, quietly, naturally. They had lunch together in the company cafeteria instead of fancy restaurants. They shared stories about their pasts, their families, their dreams. Samantha told him about her mother, who worked 2 jobs to help her finish college. Ronald told her about his late father, a man who believed that kindness was strength, not weakness, a lesson he'd forgotten somewhere along the way. But as their bond deepened, whispers began. People noticed the way he looked at her, the way his mood changed when she was near. In boardrooms and break rooms, rumors spread like wildfire. The billionaire and the intern. Some called it scandalous, others called it foolish. But neither Ronald nor Samantha cared, because for the first time, Ronald felt something that money couldn't buy: peace. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, and the building was nearly empty. Ronald sat in his office reviewing financial statements when a notification popped up on his computer screen. His bank account, 0 balance. Corporate assets, frozen. Company servers, breached. His heart pounded. He tried to log in again, only to see everything disappear in front of him. In a matter of minutes, his entire financial empire crumbled. Hacked, stolen, gone. He rushed to his IT department, but the team was powerless. The hacker had routed everything through international servers, impossible to trace. By morning, the news hit the media. Young billionaire loses entire fortune overnight in digital theft. Stocks plummeted. Investors panicked. Partners withdrew. The empire he'd built on precision and control fell apart like sand through his fingers. And in that chaos, Ronald saw what people truly were. The same colleagues who praised him turned away. Friends stopped answering calls. His penthouse became quiet, cold, and empty. He had nothing left, no money, no company, no trust. Except her. Samantha was the only one who stayed. She found him sitting alone in the dark conference room the next evening, staring at the city lights below. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes hollow. She walked in quietly and placed a cup of coffee beside him, the same way he used to bring her coffee during her late nights. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice low. "There's nothing left for you." She sat across from him. "You're wrong, Ronald. You're still here." He looked at her, disbelief written on his face. "You don't understand. I'm broke. I've lost everything." Samantha leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "No, you've just lost money. Everything else that matters, your heart, your mind, your kindness, that's still yours. And I'm not going anywhere." That night, something inside Ronald broke. But it wasn't despair. It was the wall he'd built around himself. For the first time in years, he let someone see him. Not as the billionaire, not as the CEO, but as a man who could hurt, who could fall, who could start again. He didn't know how he'd rebuild, or if he even could. But as Samantha placed her hand over his and whispered, "We'll figure it out together," he realized something profound. Maybe losing everything was exactly what he needed to finally find what truly mattered. The days that followed were heavy, almost unreal. Ronald, the man once surrounded by power, influence, and admiration, now walked through life stripped of everything that once defined him. His name had become a headline, a symbol of failure. The empire that once carried his initials had been taken over by investors eager to erase his memory. What used to be respect had turned into whispers of pity. He moved out of his penthouse. The luxury apartment that once overlooked the city skyline felt too large, too quiet, too full of memories that mocked him. He packed what little he owned into 2 suitcases and left with no destination. The sound of the elevator doors closing behind him was the sound of a chapter ending. Not with applause, but with silence. Samantha was waiting downstairs. She had insisted on helping him move. Her old, second-hand car stood parked at the curb, engine humming softly. "I told you I'd drive you," she said, smiling gently, though her eyes showed worry. Ronald hesitated before getting in. He had never ridden in a car that wasn't black, new, and chauffeured. But now none of that mattered. The leather seat was torn, the radio crackled, and the air smelled faintly of her perfume and hope. They drove in silence for a while. The city that once bowed to him now passed by unnoticed, indifferent. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, eyes on the road. "But I want to." They stopped outside a small apartment building in a quiet part of town. It wasn't much, old bricks, flickering lights, a narrow staircase. But it was hers. She led him inside and pointed to a small couch in the living room. "It's not a penthouse," she said with a shy smile. "But it's safe." Ronald stood there for a moment, looking around. The place was small, cozy, filled with signs of real life. Books stacked on the floor, a plant leaning toward the sunlight, photos of her and her mother taped on the wall. It was imperfect, but warm, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, Samantha," he said softly, "for everything." She looked at him for a moment, then said simply, "Don't thank me yet. We have work to do." The next weeks were the hardest of his life. Gone were the boardrooms, the private meetings, the luxury. Ronald found himself searching for freelance consulting jobs just to cover basic expenses. But even then, his reputation followed him. Few were willing to hire the man who'd lost millions overnight. Samantha worked extra shifts at the university library and tutoring students to help pay for groceries. Sometimes she'd come home exhausted, her hands trembling from fatigue, yet still greeted him with a smile. One evening, Ronald caught her sleeping at the kitchen table, her head resting on a pile of papers. He covered her with his jacket and stared for a long moment. She didn't have to stay. She didn't know him anything. Yet she did, without hesitation, without condition. That night, he made himself a promise. He would rebuild not to prove something to the world, but to prove himself worthy of the kind of love she had shown him. He began small, consulting for small businesses, analyzing finances, helping startups avoid the same mistakes he once made. His experience, though painful, was valuable. Slowly, word spread. He wasn't the arrogant CEO anymore. He was a man who understood failure, who spoke with humility and honesty. People began to trust him again, one conversation at a time. Samantha stood by him through every setback. When deals fell through, she reminded him of how far he'd come. When doubts crept in, she reminded him of who he was before the money. Together, they rebuilt from the ashes not an empire but a partnership. One rainy afternoon, after weeks of hard work, Ronald walked through the door of their small apartment with a spark in his eyes. Samantha looked up from her books. "You're smiling," she said, half teasing. "That's new." "I got it," he said, almost breathless. "A client. A real one." Her face lit up. "Ronald, that's amazing. It's a small business," he said, "but it's a start." She ran to him and hugged him tightly, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that everything might actually be okay. From that day on, Ronald worked tirelessly. His schedule was filled again, not with luxury but with purpose. Samantha helped him organize meetings, manage reports, and sometimes even accompanied him to small company offices. They weren't partners in title but in heart, and everyone who saw them knew it. Yet, even as they worked, something deeper grew between them. One night, after a long day, they sat on the rooftop of the apartment, watching the city lights flicker. Ronald turned to her and said softly, "You know, I used to think success was measured in zeros. Now I know it's measured in the people who stay when those zeros disappear." Samantha smiled, the wind brushing her hair across her face. "Maybe that's what life is trying to teach you." He nodded slowly. "And maybe you're the reason I was meant to learn it." She didn't answer, just leaned her head on his shoulder. They sat in silence, surrounded by the hum of life below, the stars above, and the quiet realization that love wasn't born in comfort. It was forged in struggle. Weeks later, things began to shift again. Ronald's small consulting firm gained traction. Clients referred him to others. Investors started calling, the same ones who had abandoned him months earlier. But this time, he was different. He no longer chased their approval. He chose who to work with based on integrity, not wealth. And through it all, Samantha never changed. She stayed grounded, humble, reminding him of where they began. One evening, after another successful meeting, Ronald brought home 2 slices of cake from a bakery down the street. "To celebrate," he said with a grin. Samantha laughed. "You and your fancy celebrations." "It's not fancy," he said. "It's gratitude." She tilted her head. "For what?" "For you," he said, his tone soft, genuine. "For believing in me when I didn't deserve it." Her eyes glistened. "You always deserved it, Ronald. You just needed to see it." At that moment, he realized something he had never felt before. This wasn't just love. It was grace. The kind of love that doesn't just hold you when you're strong, but when you're broken. And though he didn't know it yet, the storm that once destroyed his life had also cleared the path for the man he was always meant to become. Ronald couldn't sleep that night. Samantha's words kept echoing in his mind. Money can be lost, but character can't. He realized that he had spent most of his life building a wall of wealth around himself, thinking it would protect him. But in the end, it had isolated him. And now, when everything had been stripped away, the only hand reaching out to him was from someone who had nothing material to gain. The next morning, he woke up to the smell of pancakes. Samantha was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she cooked. "Good morning, Mr. Billionaire," she said with a teasing smile. Ronald laughed, a genuine laugh he hadn't felt in weeks. "Good morning, Miss Sunshine." They sat at the small kitchen table, eating and talking about everything but money. It felt normal, peaceful. Something Ronald hadn't known for years. In the following weeks, Samantha became his greatest support. While the world whispered about Ronald's downfall, she was there helping him rebuild from the ground up. She helped him find affordable places to stay, connected him with old friends from her university who were skilled in cybersecurity, and even assisted him in filing reports against the employee who had hacked him. But what surprised Ronald most wasn't her intelligence or determination. It was her belief in him when he didn't believe in himself. One evening, as they worked late on Ronald's laptop in a small cafe, he looked at her and said quietly, "Why are you helping me so much, Samantha? You don't owe me anything." She smiled softly and replied, "Because I've seen who you really are when the money is gone. You're not as lost as you think." Her words broke something inside him. He realized that Samantha didn't see the billionaire, the CEO, or the man from the headlines. She saw Ronald, the person. And maybe for the first time in his life, that was enough. Together, they began investigating what had happened. It turned out that a trusted senior employee named Victor, whom Ronald had mentored for years, had orchestrated the entire hacking scheme. Victor had been transferring small amounts from company funds for months, slowly building a network of accounts that bled Ronald's fortune dry. The betrayal cut deep, but Samantha was calm. "You can rebuild, Ronald," she said. "And this time, you'll know who really stands by you." One afternoon, Samantha came up with an idea. "What if you start something smaller?" she suggested. "A new company, but built on trust and transparency. Something that reflects who you've become." Ronald thought about it. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous, him starting over from scratch. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Maybe losing everything had been the only way to start living differently. They spent nights planning, sketching ideas, researching, and reaching out to people. Samantha's insights into management and her human approach balanced Ronald's sharp business instincts perfectly. What started as a desperate attempt to survive slowly became a shared dream. Meanwhile, the investigation into Victor deepened. One evening, Ronald received a message from the authorities. They had found Victor's trail. He was trying to flee the country. The police managed to intercept him at the airport, and Ronald's stolen funds began the long process of being recovered. When Ronald told Samantha the news, she smiled, but he noticed she didn't seem as thrilled as he expected. "You got your money back," she said quietly. "So what happens now?" Ronald looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Now, I find out what's worth more than money." A few weeks later, Ronald's accounts were reinstated, and his name cleared. His lawyers handled the remaining legalities, but his heart was elsewhere. In the small office he and Samantha had set up, filled with coffee cups, sticky notes, and laughter. One evening, Ronald stood outside, looking at the city lights. He turned to Samantha and said, "You know, when I met you, I thought you were just an intern." She chuckled. "And I thought you were just a spoiled CEO." They both laughed. But then Ronald's voice softened. "Samantha, I don't ever want to go back to who I was before. I want a life that feels real. And I want you in it." She froze for a moment, then smiled shyly. "Ronald, are you sure about that?" "I've never been more sure of anything." That night, under the fading glow of the city, they shared their first kiss. Simple, honest, and full of hope. For Ronald, it felt like the true beginning of his life. But the journey wasn't over yet. Though his money was returning, Ronald was faced with a choice. Go back to the empire he'd built, or stay true to the new path he'd found with Samantha. His decision would define not only his future, but also the man he had become. And deep inside, he already knew the answer. The morning sun poured through the small apartment window, casting golden light on the worn wooden floor where Ronald stood, holding a cup of coffee and watching Samantha as she organized files for their new business. She was radiant, focused, determined, and quietly graceful. He couldn't help but smile. A few months ago, he had been surrounded by marble floors, private jets, and people who only smiled because they had something to gain. Now, in this tiny place that smelled like fresh coffee and paper, he felt richer than ever. Their company, which they named Second Rise, began as a consulting startup focused on helping small businesses grow with integrity and fairness, values Ronald had ignored in his old empire. Samantha insisted on transparency, fair pay, and giving back to the community. Ronald admired how she worked with passion, even when things got hard. She was not driven by wealth but by purpose, and it changed everything about how he saw success. One day, while they were working late, Ronald received a phone call from his mother. Her voice trembled with emotion. "Ronald, the news is talking about you again. They're calling you the fallen billionaire who rose with heart. I'm proud of you, son." Ronald smiled softly. "Thanks, Mom. I think I finally found what I was missing." As the weeks passed, Second Rise began to grow. Investors who respected Ronald's resilience returned to him, offering partnerships. But this time he was careful. He refused to let greed guide him. He often looked across the office at Samantha and remembered how she had been there when no one else was. One rainy afternoon, Samantha came into his office holding an envelope. "Ronald, you should see this," she said. Inside was a letter from Victor. The man who had betrayed him was in prison now, but he had written to apologize. "I was jealous of you, Ronald. I thought money made the man, but I was wrong. Watching everything you've built back up, with honesty, made me realize what I lost." Ronald sat silently for a moment. "Do you think people like him can change?" he asked. Samantha looked at him thoughtfully. "If you could change, anyone can." Her words stayed with him. That night, Ronald couldn't stop thinking about forgiveness. He remembered how angry and broken he had been, and how Samantha's kindness had brought him back. He decided to reply to Victor's letter, not with hatred, but with forgiveness. It was something he had learned from her, that letting go of bitterness was the only way to truly rebuild. Months went by, and life began to bloom again. Second Rise became a well-known company for its ethical business model. Clients admired Ronald's humility, and many didn't even know about his past wealth. They only saw the man who genuinely wanted to help others. And Samantha, once the intern who worked quietly behind the scenes, became the heart of the company. Her empathy, wisdom, and gentle leadership inspired everyone who met her. But success wasn't without its challenges. As Second Rise grew, so did the attention. The media began focusing on Ronald and Samantha's relationship. Headlines read, "Billionaire finds love in his former intern," and "From CEO to comeback king." Ronald hated the spotlight returning. He worried it would bring pressure on Samantha, who valued privacy. One evening, he found her sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She sighed. "It's just all this attention. I never wanted fame. I only wanted to help." He sat beside her. "Neither did I. But maybe this time we can use it for something good. To show people that second chances exist. That losing everything doesn't mean losing yourself." She smiled faintly and leaned her head on his shoulder. "As long as we stay true to who we are, I'll be fine." That night, Ronald realized that Samantha was more than the woman who helped him rebuild. She was his compass. Every time he faced a hard decision, he thought of her honesty, her courage, her quiet strength. Weeks later, at an awards ceremony honoring young entrepreneurs, Ronald and Samantha stood together as Second Rise received recognition for innovation and ethics in business. Cameras flashed, applause filled the room, and as Ronald walked to the stage, he turned to Samantha. "You should be the one to accept this," he whispered. She shook her head. "We both built this, Ronald. Together." On stage, Ronald spoke from the heart. "A few years ago, I thought success was about what you own. But I lost everything, and that's when I learned that success isn't about wealth. It's about who stands beside you when you have nothing. Samantha taught me that." The crowd erupted in applause, but Ronald only saw one person, the woman who had changed his life. After the ceremony, as they walked through the quiet parking lot under the soft glow of streetlights, Ronald took her hand. "You know," he said with a small smile, "I don't ever want to go back to being that man who thought money was everything." Samantha looked up at him with a warm smile. "Good, because I fell in love with the man who lost everything, and still had the courage to start again." He laughed softly, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with wealth. "Then maybe losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me." But fate still had one last surprise waiting, one that would test their bond and reveal the true depth of what they had built together. A few months later, life had settled into a beautiful rhythm. Ronald and Samantha were inseparable, partners in business and in life. Their company, Second Rise, had become a beacon of integrity, admired for its ethical approach to success. Employees loved working there, and Ronald often joked that the office felt more like a family than a corporation. But just as everything seemed perfect, a new storm began to form. One morning, as Ronald arrived at the office, his assistant rushed toward him holding a tablet. "You need to see this," she said. On the screen was a news headline. "Former employee alleges Second Rise is a front for Ronald's hidden wealth." Ronald's stomach dropped. The article accused him of rebuilding his empire by secretly transferring his recovered fortune through shell companies under the name of Second Rise. It was all lies, but it looked convincing. Screenshots, documents, and false testimonies filled the page. Samantha entered moments later, holding her phone. "Ronald, my inbox is exploding. Investors are panicking. Reporters are calling nonstop." He clenched his fists. "It's Victor," he said bitterly. "It has to be him. He's trying to destroy me again." Samantha touched his arm gently. "Then we fight this the same way we fought before, with truth, not anger." But this time the stakes were higher. Their reputation, their company, and their hard-won peace were on the line. Ronald faced endless interviews, investigations, and legal scrutiny. Though he had nothing to hide, the media storm painted him as guilty before he could even speak. During those weeks, he barely slept. He spent long nights at the office, reviewing reports, trying to prove his innocence. Samantha was always there, her calm presence keeping him grounded, but he could see the fatigue in her eyes too. One night, as they sat in the dimly lit office surrounded by piles of paperwork, Ronald sighed deeply. "Maybe I should just shut everything down," he said. "Maybe it's not worth it." Samantha looked up sharply. "Don't say that, Ronald. You built something good, something real. You can't let lies take it away." "But what if people never believe me again?" he asked quietly. "What if I'm always going to be the man who's either too rich to trust or too guilty to forgive?" Samantha stood, walked over, and placed her hands on his shoulders. "Then let them think what they want. I believe in you, and that's not going to change." Her faith gave him strength. Together, they worked day and night gathering evidence, reaching out to allies, and contacting journalists who had once respected Ronald's honesty. Slowly, the truth began to surface. The digital forensics team traced the forged documents back to an anonymous source, one linked to Victor's old network. When the investigation results were released, Ronald was cleared. The article was proven false, and Second Rise's name was restored. But instead of celebrating, Ronald felt a deep exhaustion. He realized that every time he rebuilt his life, the world tried to pull him back to who he used to be. That night, Samantha found him on the rooftop of their building, looking out over the city skyline. The wind brushed through his hair as he stared at the glittering lights below. "You okay?" she asked softly. He didn't turn around. "I thought starting over would mean leaving the past behind. But it keeps finding me." She stepped closer. "Maybe that's because your story isn't meant to be hidden. Maybe it's meant to remind people that change is real, even when the world doubts it." He looked at her, eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "How do you always know what to say?" Samantha smiled faintly. "Because I've watched you fight for the man you want to be. And I love that man." It was the first time she had said those words out loud. Ronald froze, then smiled slowly. "Say it again," he whispered. "I love you, Ronald," she said, her voice steady. He took her hand, holding it tightly. "I love you too, Samantha. You've been my light through every storm." They stood there for a long time, surrounded by the hum of the city. Two souls who had found love not in perfection, but in survival. The next morning, Ronald made a bold decision. He called a press conference not to defend himself, but to share his story openly. When he stood at the podium, cameras flashing, he said calmly, "I was accused of something I didn't do, but I'm not here to fight the rumors. I'm here to say that no matter what anyone takes from you, money, reputation, status, the one thing they can't take is your integrity. That's what truly defines you." His words spread across the media, transforming public perception. Instead of scandal, people saw redemption. Ronald's honesty touched hearts around the world. Later that evening, Samantha walked into his office holding a letter. "It's from a foundation," she said. "They want to partner with us to help young entrepreneurs start businesses based on ethics and compassion." Ronald's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what we've been dreaming of." Samantha smiled. "You see, out of pain, something beautiful always grows." He looked at her with admiration and whispered, "You were right from the beginning. Losing everything was just the start of finding what truly matters." And for the first time in a long time, Ronald felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. But destiny wasn't finished rewarding him. A new opportunity was about to appear, one that would not only rebuild his fortune but also change countless lives, including his and Samantha's, forever. The next few months brought an energy that neither Ronald nor Samantha had ever imagined. The partnership offer from the foundation wasn't just a chance to expand. It was the opportunity to redefine what business meant. Together, they began designing a new branch of Second Rise, one that focused entirely on mentoring young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds, teaching them how to start businesses grounded in integrity, empathy, and resilience. Ronald invested his recovered fortune not into luxury, but into people, something that shocked everyone who knew him before. The man who once lived for power and wealth was now living for purpose. Samantha, by his side, became not just his partner but his equal, co-leading the program with quiet strength and grace. One morning, as the sun bathed their new office in warm light, Ronald stood by the window watching a group of young interns laughing in the courtyard below. Samantha walked up behind him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "They remind me of us," she said softly. He smiled. "Yeah, 2 people who had no idea what life had planned for them." She handed him a cup. "Do you ever regret it? Losing everything?" He turned to face her, eyes gentle. "Not for a second, because losing everything was how I found you." She blushed slightly, smiling at his words. "You're still the same charming CEO." He laughed. "Maybe, but this time I know what really matters." Their love had deepened, not out of fairy tale perfection, but from surviving storms together. It was real, grounded in the moments that tested them most. Months later, Ronald received an invitation to deliver a keynote speech at a global business conference in New York. The topic, Rebuilding from Ruin, the Power of Integrity. Samantha encouraged him to accept. "People need to hear your story," she said. The day of the event arrived. The grand auditorium was filled with executives, investors, and journalists. Ronald walked to the stage wearing a simple suit, no luxury, no pretense, just himself. Samantha sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on him with quiet pride. He began softly. "A few years ago, I thought success was something you could measure in numbers, profits, properties, possessions. Then I lost it all. My company, my money, my reputation. I thought my life was over." He paused, scanning the room. "But then someone came into my life. Someone who reminded me that success isn't about what you have, but about who you become when everything else is gone." He looked directly at Samantha as he continued. "I met a young woman named Samantha during the worst chapter of my life. She didn't see a fallen billionaire. She saw a man who could start again. Because of her, I learned that love built on honesty is stronger than wealth built on fear." The audience was silent, listening with rapt attention. "So if you take anything from my story," Ronald said, "let it be this. Sometimes, life has to break you to rebuild you into who you were meant to be. Don't fear the fall. It might just lead you to your greatest rise." When he finished, the crowd rose in applause. Cameras flashed, reporters cheered, and investors lined up to meet him. But all Ronald saw was Samantha, standing, clapping softly, tears in her eyes. After the speech, they walked outside into the crisp evening air of New York City. The lights of the skyline shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars. Samantha looked at him, still emotional. "You did it," she whispered. He smiled. "We did it." They stood for a while, just taking in the moment. Then Ronald turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "Samantha, there's one more thing I want to do." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her eyes widened as he opened it. Inside was a simple, elegant ring. "I lost everything once," he said, "but I never want to lose you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak, and finally whispered, "Yes, Ronald, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she laughed through her tears, throwing her arms around him. The city lights reflected in her eyes, and in that moment, Ronald felt something deeper than wealth, deeper than success. He felt home. Months later, their wedding took place in a beautiful garden surrounded by close friends, employees, and family. There were no luxury decorations, no media presence, just love, laughter, and sincerity. When they exchanged vows, Ronald said, "You found me when I was broken, and you made me whole. You reminded me that love is the only fortune worth keeping." Samantha smiled through tears and whispered, "And you taught me that even the richest hearts can learn to be humble." As they kissed under a sky painted with gold and pink, the crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't just the end of a love story. It was the beginning of a new legacy. Years later, Second Rise became one of the most respected companies in the world for ethical leadership. But for Ronald and Samantha, their greatest achievement wasn't the success. It was the life they had built together from the ruins of loss. And every evening, when Ronald looked at Samantha, now his wife, his partner, his forever, he would think of that first day in the internship office, when a humble girl with bright eyes walked into his world and unknowingly changed his life forever. In the end, Ronald didn't just rebuild his fortune. He rebuilt his soul, and that he knew now was the truest kind of wealth.